brought it to any conferences. I think the closest thing I ever got to was a Twitter conference at some point halfway through the pandemic. So what you're hearing is the first time I get to talk about a paper that I wrote during the pandemic, and also the things that have kind of come off that paper, but also started with the paper that I never really got to do. Um, just move slide on. There we go. So the structure of my talk is what my title is. So I'm going to talk about storytelling or the original idea. And what I thought I'd do is revisit the paper because it's been a few years for me. It's been 6 years since I wrote it, 4 years since it was published, and really kind of a year and a half since I thought about it again. So I'm going to talk about the paper a bit, and then I'm going to talk about something that came out of the paper while I was doing it, which is looking at collecting cultures and fandoms and archaeologies of fandom, and specifically K-pop fandom, which is kind of what the paper's about anyway. And I'll finish by talking a bit about transmedia archaeology and digital cultures, and how we can, I guess, theorize an archaeology of fandom, or a fandom for archaeology even. So again, just to start, this started with a paper that I published in 2022. The article was about the representation of archaeology in a South Korean stage musical, which was a bit off-piste for me. I'm a buildings archaeologist and I specialize in looking at institutional structures. Nobody ever tells you how hard it is to pivot into something new, because by 2020, I was done with that topic. I wanted to do something new, I wanted to do something different, and I was looking for, I guess, a bridge into what I really wanted to do, which was Korean studies, which is sort of, I guess, 6 years down the line. I'm still trying to cross that bridge. The musical, I never intended to write about the musical. It started because I was up at 4 o'clock in the morning on a Sunday morning during the pandemic watching this streamed musical. And I realized, because I didn't know anything about it beforehand, that the musical was about archaeology. And I realized this while I was watching it. So I started taking notes, lots of furious notes. And the notes that I took contained a lot of words that never made it into the final version of the paper. So anyone who's involved in academic publishing knows that the paper that you submit is very rarely the paper that actually makes it to print. The first paper that I submitted, that I wrote, was really chaotic. I tried to shove everything that I was thinking that Sunday morning at 4 a.m. into one paper, which was a disaster. But the peer reviewers were unbelievably kind, and they helped me to work through how to do maybe 3 papers off the back of this. And I published one of them, which is Archaeology, Emotional Storytelling, and Performance. Some of the other notes I took were consumption and participatory behavior, responsible engagement with cultural heritage, fandom as audiences for cultural heritage, online communities, organic learning and spaces where fans teach themselves and others, archaeology and fandom, archaeology of fandom, and archaeology as fandom, which I'm going to sort of represent here for the first time today. So the paper. The paper was about a musical called Return the Promise of the Day. It was a Korean stage musical, and it was broadcast online. And the reason it was broadcast online was specifically because of the pandemic. It was supposed to be in person. There had been several seasons of performance of this particular musical, and it had been very popular in Seoul. But during the pandemic, obviously, they couldn't broadcast it, well, they couldn't stage it in Seoul. So instead they broadcast it online, and there was a huge international audience for reasons that I'll get into in a moment. What the musical is about, it tells a really emotional cross-generational story. It's about a man and his grandson. It's told in the past, it's told in the future, and the furniture and materiality of archaeological fieldwork is used throughout, especially in the narrative present, to communicate ideas about finding and being found. The grandfather protagonist starts off as an old man, walking through the hills and being kind of told off by his son for putting himself in danger because he keeps getting lost in the woods and lost up in the mountains. His son, who's a physical anthropology student at university at the time, is a bit useless in school, and his grandfather kind of has a go at him about that. So the musical really starts with a disconnect across generations. The grandfather doesn't understand his grandson. The grandson doesn't understand his wandering grandfather. The grandson enlists in the Korean army to do his mandatory military service, as all young Korean men do. And during his process of being a soldier, he takes part in a series of excavations to exhume soldiers who were lost during the Korean War. During this, his grandfather becomes an informant as to where they might find the remains of his friends who died during the war. And the narrative does flash back. It flashes back to the 1950s. It flashes back to the late 1940s. It flashes back on the stage with a different cast showing young men who are the same age as his grandson going to war. It's extremely emotional. I find it difficult to talk about without getting emotional because it's staged so beautifully. But these are the dominant themes: to find, to be found, and to heal through finding. Archaeology communicates this without ever having to say, this is what we're doing. And I find this really interesting. So the brutal reality of the conflict is represented on stage. It's communicated through the material culture and representation of archaeology, which I think we're familiar with in a more heavy-handed way, but this was actually quite subtle. These are all quite, I guess, dominant themes in the heritage discourse around the Korean War in South Korea, which is a place that I'd never been when I watched the musical. So I wasn't aware of exhibitions like this one, which is the reconstructed remains of a Sergeant Lee, whose remains were found in the early 2000s, and he was reburied next to his brother in the National Cemetery. In order to sort of, I guess, discuss and talk about the excavation of these remains in the museum uses reconstructions like this. It uses the material culture of soldierdom. It uses personal items to tell personal stories. Within the musical, on the stage, I found it really interesting that this is also done kind of without, again, having to be heavy-handed about it. The archaeologists are excavating objects, and these mundane excavated objects tell stories of their own. So a pair of boots, for instance, two pairs of a left boot are discovered, and the grandfather protagonist understands who this is based entirely on the fact that he recognizes the boots. But the boots don't have to tell us who they are. They stand in the stage and they are spotlit. They are treated as characters. And this kind of material signaling really recalls those museum displays of objects that are associated with conflict. The Korean War is an incredibly emotional conflict, especially in South Korea, because South Korea never signed the armistice agreement. So on the Korean Peninsula, this is a very charged topic. It's also a topic that has, I guess, it's very difficult to communicate cross-generationally, which is why this story, I feel, was important to tell, and was important to tell the way they told it. I think maybe what was unprecedented was the international interest in the story. And that's kind of where I get into why I'm going from talking about a South Korean stage musical to talking about fandom. So the September 2020 performance of Return the Promise of the Day featured a cast of serving Republic of Korea soldiers, which at the time included two members of the enormously popular K-pop boy band EXO. These were To Kyung-soo and Kim In-sok. And they played the protagonist characters. Now, this wasn't the first time the musical had engaged enlisted idols in their staging. The previous year, one of the members of SHINee, for instance, had occupied one of these roles. So the musical had precedent for casting idol characters. And this is something that some enlisted idols will do while serving the service. They will perform. Actually, another member of EXO, who is in the sort of background picture here, he was in a different musical the following year that didn't feature archaeology, unfortunately for me. So I didn't get to follow up with a part two. But the upshot of this was that the audience for the online performance was extremely international. There were subtitles, if I recall, because I couldn't record it. Obviously, it's illegal to record things that are streamed off the internet. So if I recall, it was the subtitles were in English, in Chinese, and in Korean. And people tuned in from all over the world. The digital streaming of the musical also ignited unprecedented conversations around the Korean War, around the practice of conflict archaeology, around kind of the process of exhumation of soldiers killed in conflict, in fandom spaces where they're not normally talked about. These are in places like Reddit and Discord and on Twitter. Fans started talking about the musical because they engaged emotionally with it, even if they themselves have no personal connection with the Korean War. It's worth saying that in South Korea, popular culture already employs and engages with traditional cultural heritage spaces in interesting ways. When I was thinking about what to put in the paper, I had a sort of a slew of performances taking place in the Central Palace in the city of Seoul. Most notably, BTS performed there. NCT 127 performed a music video within the walls. So cultural heritage spaces are very much part of kind of the communication of Korean culture, which is what the Hallyu wave is all about, and I'll get that into a second. The image at the bottom, you also find K-pop and kind of, I guess, popular culture within what are more traditionally kind of, I guess, heritage spaces. So like the Korean Modern History Museum has a whole display about K-pop and the material culture of K-pop. So these are light sticks for BTS, for Twice, and for EXO. And these are displayed as kind of representative of the most popular groups of the 2010s. Okay. So what I sort of came out of that musical thinking was a lot of things. I had a notebook that was just full of scribbles. The paper itself ended up being about how archaeological stories tell archaeological material culture and the fieldwork, the representation of fieldwork can tell interesting and sympathetic stories about the past. I've already published that paper and honestly, kind of, I've moved on from it. So what I want to talk about now is the things that, I guess, the ghost papers, so the bits that didn't get published. The bits that kind of made their way or are making their way into funding applications and new collaborations that I kind of didn't really even consider at the time. I think my posit is that fandom is an archaeological layer in the material record of consumption in the late modern, and that it's very difficult to get away from, I guess, even the material impact of fandom and engagement. But how do we record and access fandom? There's a lot of pushback, especially from fans themselves, certainly within K-pop fandoms, against being ossified, against being recorded, against, I guess, being reported on. And this goes down to trust. A lot of the representations, especially of female-dominated fandoms in the past, have been that women are hysterical, and that parasocial relationships dominate all fandom spaces, and that this is damaging and wrong and something that should be, I guess, kind of judged or considered low. And I kind of contend that actually that's not the case. I mean, we can see the fact that enormously popular K-pop groups are already engaging with huge cultural heritage sites, that this is something that is not really low culture. This is something that is occupying the highest kind of levels of cultural space already. It's worth pointing out as well that even an enormously digital fandom like K-pop, they have material footprints, and these material footprints are everywhere to see when you're a fan. And I'm pointing to myself because I wasn't watching that stage musical because I thought it was about the Korean War. I was watching it because I'm a fan of EXO. And I have to be upfront about that. I approach this as a fan. But these fandoms, they have very material footprints and expressions that if you are not part of the fandom can be easy to overlook. Even major exhibitions like the one in the Modern History Museum, they prioritize the substantial and I guess the more visible and the more kind of exceptional. So light sticks, for instance, they prioritize these in favor of the ephemeral and the everyday. Objects like costumes, staging props, the light sticks I showed you before, these are more visible, obvious symbols of fandom that can be communicated. And if you watched K-pop Demon Hunters, for instance, you'll see that they use all of the furniture of K-pop fandom, and it's very obvious to a K-pop fan what you're looking at here. What's more subtle in a movie like K-pop Demon Hunters, though, is that right at the end, a little girl walks up to Rumi. Sorry, my niece is obsessed with this film. I've seen it many times. A little girl walks up to Rumi and hands her a photo card. And I thought it was a really interesting kind of underplaying of what, to my mind and certainly experience, is one of the most visible aspects of fandom culture. That in that archaeological layer, if we are excavating it down, photo cards occupy a substantial chunk of that stratigraphy. There are library collections and repositories and archives and spaces for collectability, for collector's items like this. So the most innocuous of fandom objects do tend to end up in these spaces, like the University of Sheffield's library. We have a pretty substantial collection of Korean studies. But really, librarians, archivists don't really know what to do with these small ephemeral objects, which have actually quite serious conservation requirements. Okay. So I'm just going to break for a second to talk about what K-pop is, because I've mentioned it a few times. What is K-pop? I assume that everyone in the room is probably broadly aware that K-pop is a global phenomenon. What exactly is it? It's not a genre. It's not even kind of, I guess, a stylistic concept. K-pop is just Korean popular music. It emerged, I guess, around the same time as the popularity or the increasing popularity of K-drama and other exported medias, like films, for instance, from South Korea specifically. And they're all part of what has become known as the Hallyu wave. The first photo cards in K-pop, and I'll talk about photo cards in a second, they appeared in 2010, which is about kind of, we're talking sort of 15 years after K-pop really emerges as a dominant or kind of force, yeah, a dominant force within Korean popular music. To just cycle back a bit, K-pop has its genesis in the 1990s with groups like Sotaeji and Boys, who occupy their own exhibition space in the Korean Modern History Museum for this reason. But also groups like HOT, the emergence of companies like SM Entertainment, who are behind HOT, who are behind Shinhwa, who are then behind TVXQ, Super Junior, Shiny, EXO, NCT, and into the present day, groups like aespa and Red Velvet. Um, the more popular groups in the West that you might be more aware of, like BTS, they emerged sort of in the 2010s when K-pop is all really quite well established in South Korea, but really before K-pop emerges as a global phenomenon. Photo cards appear for the first time in 2010. They are an inclusion in the second studio album of the SM Entertainment group Girls' Generation, or Sonyeoshidae in Korean. And it really, all they consist of is, of the 9 members, there's an individual random photo card of each individual member. And I have one here. So the woman in the middle is Hyoyeon, so she's one of the members. And this is the original photo card from O. So there's 10 photo cards, unbelievably collectible, can't get your hands on them type thing, of the 9 members, and then one of the whole group. After this, K-pop photo cards start to become something that is just included first in albums and then as part of fan signs, as part of events, as special gifts that are given to VIP ticket holders at concerts, and eventually kind of as part of goods. So if you buy, for instance, a limited edition t-shirt, you might get a limited edition photo card with it. If anyone has ever collected baseball cards or Pokemon cards or Yu-Gi-Oh cards or even Panini stickers, you'll know that it kind of gets out of hand after a while, that once you start collecting one, you start collecting them all. So they quickly became collectible objects. And this was not something that was, I guess, forced on fans by companies. This is a culture of collecting that fans started to organically develop themselves. Fans create, for instance, huge templates of all the collectible photo cards for individual members or groups in general. These are fan-made works that are distributed through fan spaces and are not necessarily anything to do with the companies at all. Indeed, there's a certain antipathy amongst fans for a lot of the K-pop companies involved. What photo cards are, and what I kind of want to view them as, are collectible objects, but also they're paper ephemera. So they're a document created for specific short-term use. They were never invented or created so that people would keep them and hold on to them as totemic objects, which is what they have become. They're designed to be inserts, they're designed to be extras, and they have kind of transcended this and become kind of individual characters in their own right. Photo card markets, trading online, either online or in IRL spaces, so in real life spaces, these blur the lines between digital fan behavior and being a fan on main. Because often in order to facilitate trades, fans are exchanging their real names, their real addresses, in order to kind of support that international trade. This is a picture that I took in the University of Sheffield's Korean Studies collection. Like I said, when I wrote the paper in 2020, I had no idea that I was going to go down this route. I just started in Sheffield in my current job. I just started there. I hadn't even been in the office because no one was going anywhere. I'd been in my job for 24 days at that point. I knew that Sheffield had a Centre for Korean Studies because at the time I just started learning Korean and my Korean teacher told me this. I had no idea. I certainly didn't know that there was an entire section in the library dedicated to K-pop albums. Some really old collectible K-pop albums that I had never seen in shops in the UK, of which there are very few. So I kind of got interested in the collection itself, and what it holds. And what I noticed when I opened the albums in the library, was that all the inclusions have been taken out. So the inserts, the photo cards, the strips of fake photographs, the small sort of mock Polaroids, all of these have been taken out, and I didn't know where they were. So I contacted the very kind East Asian Studies librarian, and she showed me the boxes. She showed me the folders. She showed me the amount of stuff that they have and don't know what to do with, because these objects themselves, they require their own curation and management. What I found interesting was that the first act of the library with the photo cards was to do what fans do, and they bought binders. This is the first thing you do with a card collection. Fans will collate and curate their own collections of photo cards and fan goods. Objects like these, the kind of the plushy keyrings, the stickers, the special edition limited boxes, they form part of sort of quasi sort of cabinets of curiosities that you'll find in fan homes, that you'll find in fan spaces, and sometimes that you'll find in public spaces when things like cup sleeve event happens. What's a cup sleeve event? It's an event for people who are fans of an idol or a group to go to, where they have coffee, they meet each other, and there's usually kind of freebies, so fan-made objects that are handed out. Called cup sleeve usually because the cup sleeves for the coffee are decorated with maybe stickers or images of the idol. What these kinds of behaviors represent to me is a really bottom-up approach to cultural engagement. This is all fan engagement. This is, again, it's not something that is facilitated by or funded by the companies themselves. It does benefit the companies because it supports the fandoms, especially overseas, but it is not something that is organized. And indeed, the fans don't want the companies involved in any way. These are very organic fan spaces. But these are also kind of ephemeral material cultures. And the ephemeral nature of them and the fragility of paper puts the collections at risk for long-term management. And why this is timely is that companies are starting to move away from albums, or I guess traditional CD albums, as the way that they distribute music. You're much more likely to get something like the NMIX FE304 Break Limited version, which is a plushy keyring, a bunch of stickers, a bunch of photo cards, and a card with a QR code on it that brings you to a platform where you can access the album if you need to. Companies are aware that most fans will just engage with their music straight online, straight on digital streaming platforms, so they don't necessarily need to put a CD in an album anymore to make it an album. There's been some interesting work done in the last 6 months, because that's how fast this is moving, that companies in South Korea are starting to move away from photo books altogether, to move away from paper and towards goods themselves. For SM Entertainment, which Red Velvet are part of, they released an album last year that was just a plushy keyring. That was all it was. There's a QR code that came with it, but nothing else. There was a photo card, a plushy keyring, and a box, and that was it. So in 2026, with album production moving away from paper towards goods as a vector for digital music, these paper ephemera may also start to disappear. Fans are also becoming increasingly conscious about sustainability and consumption. So as kind of fans become more activists about whether or not they will engage with some of these material cultures, they may start to disappear. So it may not be an issue yet for collections like ours at Sheffield, but it may become an issue as, for instance, these objects become more and more rare. So I put transmedia in the title of this, and then sort of asked myself why I'd done that. What is transmedia? K-pop is a transmedia fandom. Let's just say that sort of transmedia is about sort of the materiality of storytelling across multiple media. Some of the really good work on it has been done around fiction, rather than being done around kind of sorry, thought it was still someone I knew. Problem with an archaeology department. Has been done around fiction rather than been done around kind of IRL fandom spaces. But we can view K-pop as a transmedial fandom. It's a fandom that is not just about music. If you've ever met a K-pop fan, if you ever want to talk to a K-pop fan, it kind of transcends just the music that they will listen to and the idols that perform that music. A lot of fandoms have their own lore. The lore will be usually kind of I guess, imposed by the company themselves. So XO have a long lore about the fact that they are aliens with superpowers. BTS have a really complicated sort of magical realism lore that talks about kind of blending different timelines. Some companies like Hybe will go even a step further and produce works of fiction, comic books around groups like Enhypen, which actually tell stories of their own and use the characters as almost kind of the way the characters are used in fan fiction AUs. But fans create their own fanon as well, so their own canon kind of ideas about what groups are like and what's important in them. And some of these kind of cultures are very, very difficult to pin down, especially when they're hot. A word that's been used to describe the BTS fandom, for instance, ARMY, is that they're rhizomatic. So they're nodal networks connected across digital social space. I would go further and say that they're connected across material space as well. And to ignore that kind of material connection, to ignore the consumer connection, is to ignore a significant layer in how these spaces, these places, these people can be viewed in the future from the perspective of people who know nothing about the global phenomenon that is BTS. Fandom activities will extend from the material and the digital, from the real to the fiction to fan fiction, through multiple versions and platforms. And really kind of companies are only starting to catch up to this now. I was very interested when I went to South Korea the first time. I went to an exhibition that is now closed, sadly, called the Hybe Inside exhibition in the headquarters of Hybe, which is the largest K-pop company in South Korea. And they had this wall of all of the albums of all of their groups, which at that time was smaller than it is now. But they had this wall contained the works of 17, GFriend, and Hypen, TXT, Zico, BTS. But what I found interesting was that all of their paper ephemera that went into the albums was displayed alongside it. And I think I didn't appreciate that the company understood that photo cards were as important until I saw this exhibition. So in this sort of stratigraphic consumption layer of fandom, photocards stand out as both emblematic of fandom, but also very, very fragile. The popularity of photocards since 2010, because it transcends kind of corporate production cycles, photocards kind of develop their own culture around them. So imperfection of an idol image is really prized over the perfect kind of type of image that can be created. One of the most valuable photocards in existence is a photocard from XO of just the top of one of the idol's heads, sort of cut off underneath the eyes. He just cut his hair. It's called the egghead selfie. It's very popular. But these kinds of, I guess, kind of organic engagements with uncurated or I guess, unpolished images. This is something that kind of goes beyond, I guess, what K-pop is represented as being, certainly in kind of a lot of print media. And the bottom of fan behavior around photocards as being symptomatic, but just fan behavior in general, in digital spaces is kind of, sorry, this bottom of fan behavior is endemic in digital spaces, and it's really obvious within the fandom, very difficult to access outside of it. So Reddit, Discord, Twitter has very, very active and dedicated fan spaces, which, again, once you sort of jump into that rabbit hole, it's very difficult to see how nobody else in the world knows this exists. But from the outside, it can be quite impenetrable and difficult to study. This will become much, much more difficult to study as some of these places close down, as people move away from Twitter, as fandom is becoming, I guess, increasingly private, as, for instance, most fans are conscientiously quitting Twitter. Discord has recently announced that they're going to ask for age verification on their spaces, which, again, is kind of pushing people away from these spaces that can't be, when they can't be anonymous in them. Because even though kind of, I guess, fans will engage with each other IRL for photocards, which I'll talk about in a second, online anonymity is really important. Me standing up here and saying, I am a K-pop fan, I'm a big fan of XO. I mean, I can do that because I'm nearly 40 and like kind of, you know, I'm a bit more mature about these things. I would have never done this 6 years ago. I think this is why this is the first time I'm presenting this, because even in my head 6 years ago, I was thinking, come on, dude, are you serious? Like, you can't study K-pop. That's your hobby, not your job. It's still not my main research, by the way. I should just caveat that by saying this is the thing that keeps me going on the everyday. The main research is much more boring, as it usually is. Um, So to bring it kind of back to archaeology, where I'm going with this now is that I wrote a paper over Christmas that will not get finished until Easter probably at this point. But it's also I'm waiting on a book to be published because K-pop scholarship is moving really, really fast and current, and most people who are working on it or have been working on it haven't actually published yet. So there's a really good book coming out by Aram Jong in the next few weeks, and I'm waiting for it to land in my inbox so I can finish my paper. What I'd like to do is reframe photo cards as modern day amulets, so as sort of totemic, talismanic objects. So kind of taking, I guess, as my initial framework, Roberta Gilchrist's work on grave goods, that these are kind of emotive deposits, reflections of identity and status in life. I think that's what K-pop photo cards do. Why do I think that? So photo cards are an archaeological object. They're a collectible object, but they're also part of this assemblage of participatory fandom. Um, Engagement with photo cards, the closest analogy I could find to it when I first started was that growing up as a Catholic in Ireland, I recognized that older people would carry pictures of the Sacred Heart around with them. That is the closest thing I can find to fan behavior around people who collect photo cards. Engagement with these photo cards as talismanic, quasi-religious artifacts set them above just general sort of collectible objects or paper ephemera. These are like baseball cards, but unlike baseball cards, they make their way out of these albums and they make their way into keychains. They make their way onto sets of keys, onto bags, into wallets, and are carried around as a source and a symbol of strength. So they can be read as totemic objects, as symbols of collective identity and community, but also kind of personal engagement and strength. And kind of increasingly, the wearing of photo cards in keychains and wallet windows, it signifies fandom in an otherwise anonymous space. And even though if you stand outside, for instance, Wembley in June, and you saw the amount of people queuing up to get into the huge mega concert SM Town, you would have thought, how is everyone in the world not into K-pop? Because clearly everyone in the world is here in front of the O2 right now. Um, but actually being a fan of K-pop, especially outside of South Korea, can be relatively anonymizing. It can be a little bit lonely. So the wearing of keychains, the kind of display of photo cards in subtle ways, signals to other fans that you are a fan too, and that you are maybe open to approach if you have the same bias or favorite member. What I found interesting as well is that in IRL meetups, which brings me back to the original paper actually, because I was really interested in IRL meetups at the start, online only mutual friends, so OOMFs, will meet up around concerts, they'll meet up around events in real life. And in order to document this process for the rest of their online fandom, will use the photo cards as avatars for themselves. So holding the photo card, their prized photo card in front of their face or in front of them on the table, in front of a table of food. And this is a fandom behavior that is completely organic and is endemic and has sort of developed everywhere. Why I'm saying that this brings me back to the original paper. Well, the original paper had a whole section about fans meeting up around concerts. And it started because I recalled a conversation I'd had really sort of early in my days of being part of K-pop fandom about a group of fans going to see BTS in Amsterdam and all going to the Van Gogh Museum together. And that this was an event that nobody really organized kind of officially, but that they'd all decided we have nothing to do. So as a Discord server, which had at the time sort of over 100,000 people, anyone who's in Amsterdam, we're going to go to the Van Gogh Museum today. Now, it's not a takeover, it's sort of more of a communal event. And kind of fans engaging in these what are more traditional, I guess, cultural heritage or cultural spaces as part of their concert going, I think is only now being picked up. There's a lot of press, for instance, about the city of, Mexico City, asking BTS to perform a second night in Mexico City because of the revenue that it's likely to bring in. I think nobody expected the amount of money that Taylor Swift's concerts last year brought into the individual cities, not just into hotels and into hospitality, but into tourism. People are planning their holidays around going to these places. So to sum up, in 2022, I published an article about the representation of archaeology and storytelling and archaeology as a device. The original idea, I'm sorry I didn't talk about the paper more because I do feel like I should have given a conference paper on that paper before I even published it. But the original idea looked very different. And 6 years later, it's the original idea that I'm coming back to because this is where I want to go next. Now that I know about this extensive collection of boxes of stuff that's underneath our university library, this is where I want to go. So consumption as participatory behavior, responsible engagement with cultural heritage, fandoms as audience for cultural heritage and for archaeology, online communities and online organic learning spaces, and archaeology as a fandom. It kind of brought me then to thinking that archaeology itself kind of is a fandom. I mean, the way that we comport ourselves, the material culture that we surround ourselves with to communicate that we are archaeologists, that's the kind of behavior that fans engage in. Certainly, I always say that archaeology was my first kind of hyperfixation, that if I'd not got super into archaeology, I would have never continued to do, well, go into a master's and then go into a PhD. And that ultimately, if I view archaeology as being a fandom, I will never resent my job, but that's a different story. The next step for me anyway is that I'm going to try and finish this paper, this Archaeology of Fandom paper. I want to theorize this collection of thoughts, a continuation in my mind of what I consider the first approaches to an archaeology in and of fandom. Thank you.